The violent storm of raised voices had finally quieted down, leaving behind a suffocating, heavy silence in the hallways of the suburban home. Inside his small, dimly lit bedroom, Arthur stood motionless by the window, his hands trembling slightly as he stared out at the fading evening sun. For months, he had tried to turn a blind eye to the cold glances, the whispered criticisms, and the outright hostility from his son, Robert, and his daughter-in-law, Sarah. But today's argument was the final straw. He had accidentally dropped a ceramic coffee mug in the kitchen, and the barrage of insults that followed, calling him a burden, a clumsy old man who did nothing but waste their money, had shattered the last remnants of his self-respect. Taking a slow, painful breath, Arthur reached up to the top of his closet and pulled down an old, battered brown leather suitcase. It was the same suitcase he had used decades ago when he worked as a senior passenger conductor for the National Railway System. He unzipped it with heavy hands and began packing. He didn't take much, just a few pairs of simple trousers, his worn flannel shirts, his essential medications, and his reading glasses. Before closing the bag, his gaze drifted to the nightstand. Sitting in a simple wooden frame was a photograph of his late wife, Eleanor. She was smiling warmly, her eyes filled with the gentle kindness that had guided him through 40 years of marriage. Arthur picked up the photograph with both hands, holding it close to his chest as tears finally spilled over his wrinkled cheeks. "Oh, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice shaking with unbearable grief. "We poured every ounce of our sweat and blood into raising Robert. Remember how we cut back on our own clothes, skipped holidays, and worked double shifts just so he could go to the best college? We thought we were building a secure future for our family. But look at me now. I am a stranger in the very house I bought with my lifetime savings." He wiped his wet cheeks with the back of his sleeve, staring at Eleanor's picture for a long moment. Then a quiet wave of resolve washed over his tired mind. "No," he thought, straightening his posture. "I cannot stay here and let them break my spirit entirely. If I no longer have a place in my son's heart, I must find the dignity to walk away." With trembling fingers, Arthur pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hello, George?" Arthur spoke softly into the receiver, struggling to keep his tone steady. "It's me, Arthur. I've made my decision. Is there still an available room at Golden Horizons Senior Residence?" On the other end of the line, George, his closest friend and former railway co-worker of 16 years, went dead silent for a few seconds. George had lost his own wife years ago and had moved into the retirement home after experiencing a similar rift with his own family. He didn't need Arthur to explain the details. He understood the quiet humiliation all too well. "Are you absolutely sure, Arthur?" George asked quietly, his voice full of empathy. "You don't have to act in anger, my friend." "It's not anger, George. It's clarity," Arthur replied, looking around his bedroom one last time. "I cannot endure the daily insults and the cold indifference anymore. I'll take a cab and be there within the hour." Closing his suitcase, Arthur picked it up in his left hand and held Eleanor's photograph tightly in his right. He slowly opened his bedroom door and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the front entrance. As Arthur passed the open archway of the living room, he saw Robert and Sarah lounging on the plush sectional sofa. The television was blaring a noisy reality show, and a fresh pot of coffee sat on the coffee table alongside fresh pastries. Arthur's footsteps were deliberate, but neither Robert nor Sarah turned their heads. As Arthur paused for a brief second near the foyer, suitcase in hand, his son didn't even look up from his phone screen. Sarah casually took a sip of her coffee, completely ignoring the old man standing near the door with all his belongings. Not a single question was asked. No one asked where he was going, why he had a packed bag, or when he would return. The complete, icy absence of care hurt Arthur far more than any screamed insult ever could. Without saying a word, Arthur unlocked the front door, stepped out into the chilly evening air, and closed the door softly behind him. Within 40 minutes, the taxi pulled up to the serene iron gates of Golden Horizons senior residence. Waiting by the brightly lit front porch was George, wearing a heavy winter jacket. As soon as the cab stopped, George rushed forward, opening the door and wrapping Arthur in a tight, comforting embrace. "Welcome, my friend," George murmured, gently taking the heavy suitcase from Arthur's grip. "You're safe here." Inside the warm, carpeted administrative office, the facility director, Mr. Harrison, reviewed Arthur's intake paperwork. "Welcome to Golden Horizons, Mr. Arthur," Mr. Harrison said gently, looking up over his spectacles. "Standard protocol requires a family member or legal sponsor to sign the secondary contact forms during check-in. Will your son or daughter be joining us shortly to finalize the paperwork?" Arthur managed a weak, polite smile, though his eyes remained heavy with sadness. "No, Mr. Harrison, I am here entirely on my own initiative. There is no family coming." Mr. Harrison paused, a look of deep understanding passing over his face. In his many years running the facility, Arthur was one of the very few residents who had checked himself in completely alone, without a child or relative standing beside him. Over the next few weeks, Arthur slowly adapted to the quiet routine of the residence. To his pleasant surprise, Golden Horizons felt remarkably peaceful compared to the hostile atmosphere of his son's house. He spent his mornings walking along the paved garden paths, enjoying hot meals in the communal dining hall, and conversing with fellow retirees who understood the bittersweet reality of aging. Yet, during the quiet solitude of the late evenings, Arthur would sit near his bedroom window, looking out at the starry sky with Eleanor's framed photograph resting on his lap. "You left me too soon, Eleanor," he would whisper softly into the dark. "I worked double shifts on the late trains, sweating through freezing winters and boiling summers just to give Robert everything he ever wanted. I welcomed Sarah into our family with open arms, treating her like my own daughter. And yet, this is the quiet exile they handed me in return." One crisp afternoon, while taking a walk near the residence's front driveway, Arthur noticed a luxurious black sedan pull up outside the main entrance. The car doors opened, and a young man in a sharp jacket stepped out from the driver's side. He opened the rear door and helped a middle-aged woman alight. She was dressed in a long wool coat with a thick knitted scarf draped loosely over her head, partially veiling her face. A moment later, a younger woman stepped out from the passenger side carrying a small blue travel bag. She handed the bag sharply to the older woman, speaking to her in a clipped, hushed tone. Without waiting for a response, the younger woman marched into the administration office to hand over the registration documents. Within 10 minutes, the young couple walked back out,
got into their car, slammed the doors, and drove off down the highway without a single glance backward. The middle-aged woman stood alone near the concrete steps, clutching her small blue bag. Tears flowed silently down her cheeks, glistening under the afternoon sun. She took a deep, shuddering breath, composed her posture, and slowly turned toward the residence's female living wing. As she crossed the central courtyard, her pathway intersected near the bench where Arthur was standing. As soon as she noticed him looking in her direction, she quickly pulled her scarf tighter across her face, lowering her head and speeding up her pace until she disappeared behind the doors of the women's wing.
Arthur stood frozen on the gravel path, his brows furrowed in intense concentration. "Another mother's heart ground into dust today," sighed an elderly resident, sitting on a nearby bench, shaking his head sadly. "It never gets easier to watch." Arthur barely heard the man's comment. His mind was racing in hyperdrive. There was something about the woman's posture, the graceful way she walked, and the distinctive shape of her eyes that felt hauntingly familiar. 2 days later, while strolling through the resident greenhouse, Arthur spotted the same woman. She was kneeling near a flower bed, quietly potting red roses with a small garden trowel. A sudden gust of wind blew through the open greenhouse windows, catching her wool scarf and sliding it completely off her head. As the bright sunlight illuminated her face, Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. The ground seemed to drop out from beneath his feet. A wave of overwhelming shock surged through Arthur's chest. Evelyn? Could it truly be Evelyn? Before he could gather his thoughts or step forward, George walked up behind him, clapping a warm hand on his shoulder. "There you are, Arthur. Lunch is being served in the main dining hall. Everyone is taking their seats, and here you are daydreaming in the greenhouse. Come on, let's grab a table." Arthur remained completely still, his eyes fixed on the woman tending to the roses. His expression was pale and blank. "Arthur? Hey, buddy, are you all right?" George asked, his tone turning concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Arthur blinked rapidly, pulling his gaze away with great effort. "Oh, no, George, I'm sorry. I was just distracted. Tell me, George, that lady potting the roses over there, she moved in just 2 days ago, right? Why is she doing physical work in the greenhouse already? Standard facility guidelines state that new residents get at least a week of mandatory rest before taking up voluntary activities." George glanced over at her and let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. "Ah, Mrs. Evelyn. Ever since her family dropped her off 48 hours ago, she has done nothing but sit in her room crying her eyes out. She refused to eat or talk to anyone. Mr. Harrison noticed how deeply distressed she was and gently suggested she help out with the roses, just to give her hands something to do and keep her mind off her heartbreak." Arthur listened quietly, a heavy lump forming in his throat. "I see. Let's go get some lunch." Throughout lunch in the bustling dining hall, Arthur sat silently, picking at his food. His eyes constantly darted toward the entrance, but Evelyn's designated chair at the women's table remained empty. Arthur's mind traveled back to community gatherings nearly 5 years ago. He remembered how Evelyn, a respected, retired schoolteacher, would always talk so glowingly about her children, proudly telling everyone how her son and daughter took such wonderful care of her. To see that same proud, gentle woman sitting alone in a senior home, broken-hearted and trying to hide her face from the world, filled Arthur with a profound, aching sorrow.
Later that evening, unable to rest with the worry pressing on his heart, Arthur walked over to the quiet corridors of the women's residential wing. As he reached the open door of room 114, he saw Evelyn sitting alone near the window, staring out at the dark courtyard while weeping silently into a handkerchief. Knocking softly on the wooden doorframe, Arthur took a cautious step inside. "Evelyn?" Evelyn gasped, startled by the voice. She quickly wiped her eyes and looked up. When she saw Arthur standing in the warm light of her doorway, her eyes widened in shock, followed immediately by a wave of intense shame and embarrassment. She instinctively reached for her scarf to cover her face. "Evelyn, please, don't hide," Arthur spoke gently, his voice full of warmth and respect. "I recognized you the moment the wind caught your scarf in the greenhouse today, and I know you tried to avoid me on the driveway 2 days ago. But please, tell me, how did a woman as loving and kind as you end up in a place like this?" Evelyn closed her eyes tightly, fresh tears spilling over her lashes. For a long moment, she couldn't form words, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Watching her pain made Arthur's heart burn with a mixture of deep sorrow and intense frustration. He felt an overwhelming urge to cry out against the cruelty of the world. Why do grown children view their aging parents as disposable burdens the moment they build their own lives? Why are the very parents who gave up their youth, their finances, and their health cast aside like old, unwanted furniture? Engulfed in his turbulent thoughts, Arthur excused himself quietly and walked out into the central garden path to clear his head. The night air was freezing, and his mind was spinning with bitter memories. Distracted, Arthur failed to notice a raised concrete border along the walkway. His foot caught the sharp edge, and he stumbled forward awkwardly, barely catching himself against the sturdy trunk of a large oak tree. "Whoa, careful there, sir," a young night shift order taker called out, sprinting across the lawn to catch Arthur's arm. "Are you all right, Mr. Arthur? Did you twist your ankle or hurt your knee? Please, sit down on this bench. Let me run to the clinic room and grab an ice pack and bandages." Arthur forced a tired, reassuring smile, waving his hand dismissively. "No, no, my boy, I am fine. Just a momentary lapse in attention. No harm done." As the young worker walked away, Arthur sat down heavily on the cold wooden bench. The physical stumble triggered a vivid, agonizing memory from 6 months ago, a rainy Tuesday evening at his son's house. Arthur had slipped on the wet bathroom tiles after taking a shower, crashing hard onto the floor and badly twisting his right knee. His daughter-in-law, Sarah, had walked past the open bathroom door, looked at him lying in pain on the floor, and simply stepped over the small puddle of water without extending a hand to help him up. When Robert finally came upstairs, instead of asking if his father was hurt or offering comfort, his face exploded in sharp, vein-popping anger. "Can't you even walk properly anymore, Dad? What on earth were you rushing for? Do you have any idea how much money we spend every time you need a doctor or physical therapy? You never think before doing anything. If you're this helpless, why don't you just stay locked in your bedroom instead of wandering around my house all day creating extra work for Sarah?" Not a single question about his pain, not a single drop of empathy. And then there was the afternoon his reading glasses broke. When Arthur asked Robert if he could take him to the local optician to get a replacement lens because he couldn't read his daily books, Sarah had scoffed loudly from the kitchen.
Must be nice sitting in an armchair all day long, coming up with new ways to drain our bank account. You act like a spoiled child demanding constant attention." Every harsh word, every cruel insult had been burned into Arthur's memory like a searing iron.
"Arthur, you'll never guess what just happened." George's enthusiastic voice shattered Arthur's painful memory. Arthur looked up to see George walking down the sunlit garden trail, a beaming, radiant smile across his face. "What has brought such a big smile to your face today, George?" Arthur asked, attempting to lift his own dark mood. "My son, David, called me this morning," George announced proudly, his eyes shining with emotion. "Today is his 35th birthday, and he told me he's driving over to visit me for 20 minutes this afternoon. I haven't seen his face in over 14 months, Arthur. I can hardly contain my excitement." Arthur stared at his old friend, a bittersweet feeling washing over him. "George, David is the exact same son who brought you here over a year ago and hasn't picked up your phone calls for months. He's coming for a brief 20-minute visit on his own birthday, and you are this ecstatic?" George's bright smile softened into something humble and deeply emotional. "At least he remembers I exist, Arthur. For a father's heart, even 20 minutes of crumbs feels like a feast." Arthur didn't have the heart to argue further, but as he walked back toward his room, a profound realization hit him. "This isn't just my tragic story, or Evelyn's, or George's," he thought. "Every door in this building hides a story of heartbreak. No parent checks into a senior residence because they want to abandon their family. They come only when their dignity has been completely eroded at home." To keep his mind engaged during the long, quiet afternoons, Arthur spent his hours writing poetry. He had always possessed a talent for verse, and writing allowed him to process his silent grief. One afternoon, sitting at his small wooden desk with a pen in hand, Arthur was pouring his deepest emotions onto a crisp sheet of paper. Tears blurred his vision as he described the loneliness of aging. Suddenly, a polite knock echoed at his open doorway. Arthur quickly folded the sheet of paper, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and wiped his eyes with a tissue. "Yes, come in." Mr. Harrison, the director, stood in the hallway with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Arthur, you have visitors waiting in the main administration lounge. Your son, your daughter-in-law, and your grandson have just arrived." Arthur went completely rigid. A cold wave of disbelief, followed quickly by a surge of defensive bitterness, filled his chest. Why now? Why after nearly 4 months of complete radio silence? Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Arthur walked slowly down the long carpeted corridor toward the front reception lounge. The moment he stepped through the glass doors, his 5-year-old grandson, Leo, spotted him from across the room. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" The little boy shrieked with pure joy, sprinting across the tile floor with his arms wide open. Arthur's protective emotional walls crumbled instantly. He dropped to his knees, caught little Leo in his arms, and pulled him into a desperate, loving hug, burying his face in the boy's soft hair as tears streamed down his face. For months, he had built a hard shell around his emotions, but the innocent warmth of his grandson shattered it completely. However, as Arthur looked up over Leo's small shoulder, he saw Robert and Sarah standing near the front counter. They looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting their weight nervously and checking their wristwatches. Arthur's warm expression hardened instantly. He set Leo down gently on a chair, stood up to his full height, and walked over to his son. His tone was cold, sharp,
and entirely devoid of warmth. "Why are you here, Robert?" Robert cleared his throat awkwardly, avoiding his father's piercing gaze. "Dad, well, today is Leo's 5th birthday. We're hosting a big dinner party at our house this evening. We ordered a massive cake and catering. But Leo threw a huge tantrum this morning, insisting that he won't cut his birthday cake unless his grandfather is sitting right next to him. So, we came to pick you up." Arthur let out a quiet, bitter laugh, shaking his head in utter disbelief. "So, my presence is required as a birthday prop?" "Dad, don't be like that," Robert pressed on, taking a step closer and lowering his voice. "We've invited all our neighbors, our church members, Sarah's extended family, and even a few of your old railway colleagues. Everyone is going to be asking where you are. If they find out you're living in a retirement facility, do you have any idea how bad that will make Sarah and me look? What will happen to our reputation in the community?" Arthur stared at his son with profound, devastating disappointment. "Ah, so that is your true motivation. You didn't drive here out of love, care, or concern for your father's well-being. You came because you are terrified of social embarrassment. You are worried about what the neighbors will say when they realize you threw your aging father out of his own home. For 4 months, I have lived in this facility. Not once did you pick up the phone to ask if I was healthy, if I had my heart medication, or if I was even alive. And now, when your precious social vanity is threatened, you show up here expecting me to play the happy grandfather for your guests?" Arthur turned his back on them. "I am not going anywhere with you. This facility is my home now." Panicking at the prospect of returning home empty-handed and facing humiliating gossip from their guests, Sarah immediately stepped forward, her hands folded in a dramatic plea. "Please, Arthur, we are so sorry," Sarah begged, her voice high and trembling. "We know we made mistakes in the past, but please, it's little Leo's special day. Won't you set aside your pride just for your grandson's happiness?" Little Leo ran over, tugging gently on Arthur's trousers. "Please come home with me, Grandpa. I want you to blow out the candles with me." Looking down into the wide, innocent eyes of his beloved grandson, Arthur felt his resolve weaken. He knew he could never inflict emotional pain on an innocent child who loved him dearly. Arthur closed his eyes, took a long breath, and turned back to Robert. "I will come to the house for Leo's birthday party, but hear me clearly, Robert. The very second the party ends tonight, you will put me in your car and drive me straight back to this residence. No excuses, no negotiations." Relieved beyond words, Robert and Sarah quickly agreed to the condition. The evening celebration at Robert's house was lavish and loud. Dozens of guests filled the decorated living rooms, music played in the background, and neighbors praised Robert and Sarah for hosting such a wonderful event. Arthur moved through the crowd with quiet grace, smiling warmly for his grandson, cutting the cake beside him, and chatting pleasantly with guests, revealing absolutely nothing of the deep rift inside their family. Late that night, after the last guest had departed and the house fell silent, Arthur retired to his old bedroom to sleep before his morning transfer back to the senior residence. Sitting on the edge of the familiar mattress, his gaze drifted around the quiet room, his thoughts turning to his late wife, Eleanor. He vividly recalled cold winter nights decades ago, returning home exhausted from a 16-hour railway shift. Eleanor would always be waiting for him in the warm kitchen, serving him freshly cooked, steaming meals. "Eat a little more, Arthur," she would say, with a gentle, loving smile, placing an extra serving on his plate.
You've been out in the freezing cold all day. You need your strength to stay healthy." "Eleanor, please," Arthur would chuckle softly. "My stomach is completely full. How much more food are you going to force on me?" A heavy, painful sigh escaped Arthur's lips in the dark room. What a devastating contrast, he thought bitterly. Eleanor spent her life ensuring I was cared for with deep affection and dignity, and here, my own daughter-in-law treated every single plate of food she gave me as a burden, expecting me to handle heavy yard work, grocery errands, and house cleaning just to earn my keep. I never minded helping out, but to be treated like an unwanted, degraded servant in the very home I paid for? No life is worth living under such constant emotional abuse. Early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, Robert and Sarah were already dressed and patiently pacing outside Arthur's bedroom door. "Dad, please hurry up and get dressed," Sarah called out sharply through the door, her voice dripping with underlying anxiety. "We need to drive you back to Golden Horizons before the morning traffic gets heavy." In truth, Sarah had spent the entire night tossing and turning in bed, terrified that Arthur might change his mind, demand to stay in his old room, and ruin her domestic routine once again. She wanted him out of her house as quickly as humanly possible. Arthur stepped out of his bedroom carrying his brown suitcase and holding Eleanor's framed photograph. He looked at Sarah's tense face with crystal-clear understanding. He read her selfish thoughts like an open book, but a calm, subtle smile touched his lips.
"My dear Sarah," Arthur thought as he walked out to the sedan, "you have no idea what is waiting for you today. By the time I step out of your car, you will never look at a parent the same way again." The drive back to Golden Horizons was filled with uncomfortable silence. When the car finally pulled up to the entrance gates of the residence, Robert and Sarah stepped out of the front seats, standing near the doors as Arthur climbed out of the back. Arthur began walking toward the main glass entrance, but after a few paces, he stopped, turned around, and called back to them in a commanding voice. "Robert, Sarah, stop right there. Before you drive away, there is someone very important I want both of you to meet." Frowns of confusion crossed their faces, but Robert and Sarah followed Arthur into the sunny central courtyard. Arthur walked over to a nearby staff member and requested that Mrs. Evelyn be invited into the courtyard for a moment. A few minutes later, the glass doors opened, and Evelyn stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, her head uncovered and her hands folded quietly in front of her. The moment Sarah's eyes registered Evelyn's face, her entire body went completely rigid. The color drained from her cheeks until she looked pale as a sheet. The leather purse she was holding slipped from her frozen fingers, crashing heavily onto the concrete walkway. "Mother?" Sarah gasped, her voice choking in pure, unadulterated shock. Sarah sprinted across the lawn, grabbing Evelyn's hands in a frenzy of panic and disbelief. "Mother, what on earth are you doing here? How are you in a place like this?" Evelyn slowly, deliberately, pulled her hands out of Sarah's frantic grip, stepping back and looking at her daughter with cold, painful dignity. I don't understand," Sarah cried out hysterically, tears streaming down her face. "I spoke to my brother Mark on the phone just last week. He told me you were away on a 2-month luxury vacation trip across the country. Why did no one tell me you were living in a senior residence?" Evelyn raised her chin, her eyes glistening with deep, sorrowful tears. "Because your brother and his wife dropped me off at this facility over a month ago, Sarah.
They invented the lie about a vacation so you wouldn't ask embarrassing questions or demand your share of my inheritance. How could Mark do such a cruel thing to you? Sarah screamed, covering her face in anguish. If I had known even for a single second that they abandoned you here, I would have rushed over and brought you to live in my house immediately. Evelyn let out a bitter, heartbroken laugh that cut through the quiet morning air. "Bring me to live in your house, Sarah?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with righteous anger. "I saw your father-in-law, Arthur, standing right here in this courtyard the very day I arrived. Tell me, my daughter, if there is absolutely no difference between how my daughter-in-law treated me and how you treated your own husband's father, how could I ever bring myself to ask you for shelter?" Evelyn took another step back, severing the physical distance between them. "You stand here screaming in rage at your brother for discarding his mother." Evelyn spoke clearly, her voice echoing across the courtyard for all the staff and residents to hear. "Yet you did the exact same cold-hearted thing to the man who built the very home you sleep in. Both of my children turned out to be selfish, heartless hypocrites. I am deeply ashamed to call myself your mother today."
Sarah stood completely frozen, utterly destroyed under the crushing weight of her own hypocrisy. The brutal reality hit her like a physical blow. She had spent months humiliating, mocking, and neglecting her father-in-law, totally oblivious to the fact that her own precious mother was enduring the exact same cruel abandonment at the hands of her brother. Overcome with agonizing guilt and shame, Sarah collapsed to her knees on the grass, reaching out and grabbing Arthur's shoes. "Please forgive me, Arthur," Sarah sobbed hysterically, her face buried near his feet. "I was blind, selfish, and cruel. I never realized the terrible pain I was causing. Please, I beg you, forgive me." Robert stepped forward, his face flushed red and tears streaming down his cheeks. He folded his hands in desperate plea before his father and Evelyn. "Dad, Evelyn, please come home with us right now. Give us a chance to fix this. We will dedicate our lives to taking care of both of you with all the honor and love you deserve. Please, give us one last chance to make things right." Arthur looked down at his sobbing daughter-in-law and his desperate son. His face was entirely serene, devoid of anger or bitterness, but as unyielding as solid granite. "No, Robert," Arthur said, his voice soft, yet echoing with absolute finality. "Respect and love are not faucets that you can turn on only when guilt strikes your conscience. Our bodies are fragile, and our hearts have been broken too many times to step back into the house where we were degraded. You cannot heal months of cruelty with 5 minutes of panicked regret." Evelyn stood shoulder to shoulder beside Arthur, nodding in firm agreement. "We have found peace, dignity, and true companionship here among people who respect us. We are staying." Despite continuous weeping, begging, and desperate promises from Robert and Sarah, both elderly parents remained immovable. Realizing that no amount of tears could erase the deep emotional scars they had inflicted, Robert and Sarah finally picked up Sarah's purse and walked back to their car with bowed heads and shattered spirits. When they arrived back at their house, the building felt suffocatingly empty and cold. Walking into his father's former bedroom, Robert noticed a folded sheet of paper resting on the bedside table, the poem Arthur had been writing,
which had accidentally slipped from his shirt pocket during his overnight stay. Robert picked up the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it. Written in Arthur's elegant, precise handwriting were lines of profound poetry describing a father's lifelong sacrifices, the painful realization of becoming unwanted in their own home, and the silent, unshakable dignity of an old man choosing independence over toxic charity. Every single word felt like a sharp dagger thrust directly into Robert's chest. Collapsing onto his father's bare mattress, Robert buried his face in his hands and wept uncontrollably into the quiet room. In the months that followed, Arthur updated his bank accounts, ensuring that his monthly railway pension checks were routed directly to his personal account at Golden Horizons, completely cutting off the financial assistance he used to provide for Robert's household expenses. It is often said that children inherit the physical structures built by their parents, but when gratitude dies within a family, parents must find the courage to build a new life of dignity elsewhere.
1 year later, the central courtyard of Golden Horizons was transformed into a paradise of blooming roses, white fairy lights, and colorful ribbons. Gentle classical music floated through the air as residents, nurses, and staff gathered in their best attire. With the warm encouragement of their fellow residents and Mr. Harrison, Arthur and Evelyn, two resilient souls who had discovered deep understanding, mutual respect, and profound love in the autumn of their lives, were united in a beautiful, intimate wedding ceremony right within the gardens of the residence. The administration presented them with a spacious, sunny private suite overlooking the rose gardens. Recognizing their immense wisdom, patience, and compassion, the management also appointed Arthur and Evelyn as the official resident welcome coordinators, giving them a meaningful purpose to mentor and comfort new seniors moving into the residence. Surrounded by genuine friends, a noble purpose, and a deep, enduring love, Arthur and Evelyn finally discovered the peace, warmth, and respect that had been denied to them for so long, proving to the world that even after the stormiest sunset, life can bestow a breathtakingly beautiful twilight.